The year is 1324. The stone streets of Kilkenny, Ireland are slick with rain and secrets. In the flickering light of torches, whispers travel faster than the wind. Whispers of a woman who walks in shadows, a woman whose touch turns men to dust and their fortunes into gold. They call her a sorceress. They call her a heretic. But to the powerful men of the city, she is simply Dame Alice Kyteler, the wealthiest woman in the land. Yet behind the heavy oak doors of her inn, something dark is brewing. Is she merely a victim of jealous men, or has she truly shaken hands with the devil himself? Tonight, we begin the terrifying true story of the first person in Ireland to be condemned for witchcraft. Welcome back to Overnight Historian, where the past never sleeps. Tonight, we are opening the dusty pages of a medieval court case that reads like a horror novel. This is the story of Alice Kyteler, a tale of greed, poison, and a burning stake that would change history forever. If you are brave enough to walk through the dark history of the Middle Ages with us, please subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. We have a 5-part journey ahead of us. Now, let's step into the darkness of 14th century Ireland. To truly understand the horror that would engulf the city of Kilkenny, we must first understand the world in which Alice Kyteler lived. It was the early 14th century, a time when life was short, brutal, and governed by the rigid laws of the church and the crown. Ireland was a divided land, torn between the native Gaelic chieftains and the Anglo-Norman settlers who had built stone-walled towns to protect themselves from the wild Irish outside. Kilkenny was one such town, a bustling, thriving center of commerce, filled with merchants, knights, and monks, and at the very top of this social hierarchy stood Alice Kyteler. Born in 1280 to a family of Flemish merchants who had settled in the county, Alice was not like other women of her time. While most women were relegated to the shadows of domestic life, silent and obedient, Alice was a force of nature. She was charismatic, intelligent, and possessed a sharp, calculating mind that understood the one language spoken by all men: money. But Alice's path to power was paved with the tombstones of her husbands. By the time the witch trials began, Alice was in her 40s and had already been widowed 3 times. Her first husband was William Outlaw, a wealthy merchant and moneylender of the town. It was a good match, solidifying her status in Kilkenny's high society. Together, they built a business empire, and Alice gave birth to her first and favorite son, William Outlaw, Jr. However, the marriage did not last long. William Outlaw died suddenly and under mysterious circumstances. In a time before modern medicine, sudden death was not uncommon, attributed to bad air or God's will. But William left Alice a very rich young widow. She inherited his money-lending business, his properties, and his influence. Instead of retreating into mourning, Alice expanded the business. She began to lend money to the local lords, holding their debts over their heads, effectively buying their loyalty and protection. Not long after, Alice married her second husband, Adam LeBlond of Callan, another man of significant wealth. The pattern, unsettlingly, repeated itself. Adam, too, died shortly after the union, leaving his vast fortune to Alice. By now, the townspeople of Kilkenny had begun to talk. In the taverns and marketplaces, over cups of ale, they whispered about the luck of Alice. How could one woman be so unfortunate in love, yet so fortunate in finance? Was it truly bad luck, or was there a darker art at play? The whispers grew louder when she married her third husband, Richard de Valley, a powerful landowner from Tipperary. Richard was a man of status, a man who should have been safe. Yet he too withered away. He died, leaving Alice not only his wealth, but also the bitter resentment of his children from a previous marriage. They watched in horror as their father's inheritance, land, gold, and cattle, was transferred into the hands of this black widow. By 1324, Alice Kyteler was the wealthiest person in Leinster. She lived in a grand house in the centre of Kilkenny, which served as an inn and a meeting place for her business dealings. She walked the streets draped in fine silks and imported velvets, her fingers heavy with jeweled rings that had once belonged to the wives of her dead husbands. She was feared, she was envied, and she was hated. The families of her deceased husbands, the outlaws, the Leblunds, and the de Valleys, began to gather in secret. They compared notes. They spoke of how their fathers had been healthy one day and wasting away the next. They spoke of Alice's strange behavior, her late-night meetings, and the peculiar dust she was seen sweeping from the streets towards her son's house. They claimed she would chant, "To the house of William my son, hie all the wealth of Kilkenny town." But Alice was arrogant. She believed her wealth was a shield that no sword could pierce. She had the local magistrates in her pocket. She had the Chancellor of Ireland as a relative. She looked down on the rumors as the jealous ramblings of the poor. She did not see the storm gathering on the horizon. She did not know that her fourth husband, Sir John le Poer, was about to fall ill with a sickness that felt like fire in his veins. She did not know that this time the whispers would not just remain in the taverns. This time they would reach the ears of a man who feared nothing but God, a man who was coming to Kilkenny not to save souls, but to burn them. The stage was set for a conflict that would tear the city apart, pitting the secular power of gold against the spiritual fire of the Inquisition. The Black Widow of Kilkenny had spun her web perfectly, but she was about to catch a predator far more dangerous than any she had faced before. If the death of 3 husbands was a tragedy, the marriage to a 4th was an act of defiance. Alice Kyteler, now in the autumn of her beauty but the prime of her power, did not retreat into the shadows of widowhood. Instead, she set her sights higher than ever before. Her first 3 husbands had been men of commerce and land, wealthy but ultimately commoners in the eyes of the true aristocracy. Her 4th choice would be different. Sir John le Poer was a knight, a man of noble blood and martial prowess, a member of one of the most powerful families in Ireland. To marry him was to ascend to a level of social standing that few merchant daughters could ever dream of. It was a union that should have secured Alice's safety forever, placing her beyond the reach of petty gossip and the jealous sneers of the townspeople. But fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. The marriage that was meant to be her crowning glory would instead become her undoing, the final catalyst for a nightmare that had been brewing for decades. At first, the union seemed prosperous. Sir John was a man of vitality, broad-shouldered and strong, a stark contrast to the aging merchants Alice had buried. But within months of the wedding feast, a shadow fell over the household. It began subtly, a fatigue that Sir John could not shake, a coldness in his extremities that the roaring hearth could not banish. Then the sickness took a turn for the grotesque. The knight, once feared on the battlefield, began to wither as if consumed by an invisible fire. His hair, thick and dark, began to fall out in clumps, leaving patches of pale, sickly scalp exposed. His fingernails and toenails turned gray and brittle, eventually detaching from the nail beds and dropping off entirely. His skin lost its color, turning a translucent, waxy gray, stretching tight over his bones as his muscle mass evaporated. To the observers in Kilkenny, it looked as if the life force was being sucked out of him drop by some parasitic entity. Sir John was terrified. He was a man who could face a sword without flinching, but this silent, creeping decay was an enemy he could not fight. It was in this state of vulnerability and terror that the vipers struck. They did not come with daggers, but with words. The children of Alice's previous husbands, the daughters of Adam le Blund, the sons of Richard de Valleys, had long harbored a festering hatred for their stepmother. They had watched their father's fortunes vanish into Alice's coffers, leaving them with meager inheritances, while Alice's own son, William Outlaw, lived like a prince. Now they saw an opportunity. They joined forces with Sir John's own children, who were watching their father waste away with growing horror. They gathered at the sickbed of the dying knight, their faces masks of concern, but their whispers laced with poison.
"Look at you, father," they would murmur. "This is not a sickness of the body, this is a sickness of the soul. Look at how her previous husbands died. Do you not see the pattern? She is feeding off you. She is stealing your life to extend her own." Day after day, night after night, they dripped this poison into his ear. They spoke of the strange powders Alice kept in her room, of her late-night wanderings, of the way she looked at him not with love, but with a cold, calculating hunger.
Sir John, his mind clouded by pain and fear, began to believe them. The woman he had married, the woman who brought him broth and smoothed his brow, transformed in his fevered imagination into a monster. He began to see malice in her touch, cruelty in her smile. The paranoia grew until it became a living thing, choking him as surely as the sickness. He became convinced that he was being poisoned, that every meal Alice served him was laced with sorcery. The stepchildren, sensing that the iron was hot, urged him to act. "You must find the proof," they urged. "She keeps her secrets in the great oak chests at the foot of her bed, the chests she forbids anyone to touch. If you want to live, you must see what is inside." Driven by a desperate, frantic need for the truth, Sir John mustered the last of his failing strength. One afternoon, when the house was quiet, he confronted Alice. It was not a conversation, but an ambush. He demanded her keys. When she refused, calm and imperious as always, he did not back down. For the first time, the knight used his physical power against her, wresting the heavy ring of iron keys from her belt. Alice stood back, her face unreadable, watching as her husband dragged himself toward the forbidden chests. With trembling hands, Sir John unlocked the heavy iron hasps and threw back the lid. The smell that wafted out was said to be indescribable, a mix of old herbs, decay, and something sharp and chemical. What he found inside would be recorded in the annals of the Inquisition as the ultimate proof of heresy. There were vials of strange, murky liquids that shimmered in the dim light. There were bags of powders, some black as soot, others the color of dried blood. But as he dug deeper, the items became more terrifying. He found the skull of a thief stolen from the gallows, its bones stained and etched with strange symbols. He found a sacrificial wafer, the body of Christ used in the Holy Mass, but on it, stamped in red ink, was the name of the devil. And beneath it all, hidden in the lining of the chest, were ingredients that spoke of a magic darker than mere superstition. The intestines of unbaptized infants, boiled and dried, herbs harvested by the light of the moon, and wax figurines shaped like men, pierced with needles. Sir John stared at the contents of the chest, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. This was not the paraphernalia of a healer or a merchant. This was the toolkit of a sorceress. He looked up at Alice, expecting to see fear or guilt. Instead, legend says she looked at him with a cold, detached pity, as if he were a bug she had already crushed. "You should not have looked," she might have said, though history does not record her words, only her silence. Sir John slammed the chest shut, clutching the keys as if they were a holy relic. He had the proof. He had the weapon that would destroy her, but he was too weak to wield it alone. He sent word to his children and the stepchildren who had goaded him on. "It is true," he told them, his voice a rasping whisper. "Everything you said is true. She is a witch." The revelation set the city of Kilkenny ablaze with scandal. This was no longer a matter of a greedy widow. This was a matter of heresy. Sir John le Poer, supported by the united front of the stepchildren, formally denounced Alice Kyteler. But they did not go to the local sheriff. They knew Alice's money had bought the loyalty of the secular authorities. The sheriff would likely bury the accusation for a bag of silver. No, for a crime this heinous, they needed a judge who answered only to God. They drafted a formal letter of complaint detailing the contents of the chest and the suspicious deaths of the 3 previous husbands. They accused Alice Kyteler and her followers of denying the faith, of sacrificing to demons, and of using sorcery to murder and rob the faithful. They sent this letter not to a local priest, but to the bishop's palace.
They were handing Alice over to the Inquisition. As Sir John lay dying, his body finally surrendering to the sickness that had consumed him, he likely believed he had struck a blow for justice. He did not realize that he had just uncorked a bottle of holy wrath that would consume not just his wife, but the entire city. The fourth husband's curse was not just his illness, it was the chain of events his fear had set in motion, a chain that would drag the medieval world into a frenzy of fire and blood. Alice Kyteler stood alone in her grand house, the keys gone, her secrets exposed. The silence before the storm had ended. The bishop was coming. Into this volatile mix of family betrayal and small-town suspicion stepped a man who would become the architect of Alice Kyteler's nightmare. His name was Richard de Ledred, the Bishop of Ossory. To understand the ferocity of the storm that was about to break, one must understand the man at its center. Ledred was not a local priest content with the quiet rhythms of rural Irish life. He was an outsider, an Englishman, and a Franciscan friar obsessed with the purity of the faith. He had been appointed by the Pope himself and sent to Ireland not merely to shepherd the flock, but to discipline it. In his eyes, the Anglo-Norman settlers and the native Irish had strayed too far from the light of Rome, sinking into a bog of moral decay, lawlessness, and pagan superstition. He saw the devil lurking in every shadow, and he believed it was his divine mission to root out heresy with fire and sword. When the children of Alice's husbands came to him, clutching their letters of accusation and the proof from the iron chest, they did not find a cautious judge. They found a fanatic who had been waiting for a sign. Bishop Ledred listened to their stories of sudden deaths, of mysterious powders, and of a woman who grew rich while men died. But where the townspeople saw a murderess, Ledred saw something far terrifying, a heretic. To him, Alice Kyteler was not just poisoning bodies, she was poisoning the soul of his diocese. He took the accusations and, fueled by his deep-seated paranoia and theological obsession, expanded them into a grand narrative of satanic worship. The charges he drafted were not merely criminal, they were apocalyptic. He claimed that in the city of Kilkenny there existed a coven of heretics who had rejected the Christian faith for the service of the devil, and at their head sat the wealthy, beautiful Dame Alice.
The specifics of the bishop's accusations were detailed, grotesque, and designed to incite maximum horror. He claimed that Alice and her followers, whom he alleged included her son William Outlaw, would gather in the dead of night at crossroads, the traditional meeting places of the supernatural. There they would perform sacrifices, not to God, but to demons. Ledred wrote that they dismembered living animals, offering the severed limbs of red cocks to the evil one. He described rituals where they would brew loathsome potions in the skull of a beheaded robber, mixing the brains of unbaptized children with spiders, black worms, and herbs harvested under dark stars. These were not just stories to Ledred, they were facts written in the ink of holy dread. But the accusation that truly captured the bishop's dark imagination, and the one that would ensure Alice's infamy, concerned her personal relationship with the supernatural. Ledred was convinced that Alice did not act alone. He claimed she had a familiar, a spirit sent from hell to serve her whims and satisfy her desires. He named this demon Robin Artisan, or Robin, son of art. In the bishop's fevered writings, Robin Artisan was a shapeshifter. Sometimes he would appear to Alice as a shaggy black dog bounding through the shadows of her bedchamber. Other times he was a black cat, watching the household with unblinking, glowing eyes. And sometimes, most damning of all, he appeared as a black man, tall and imposing, who carried an iron rod. The bishop accused Alice of having carnal knowledge of this demon. He painted a picture of perverse intimacy, claiming that Alice would give herself to this creature in exchange for his dark magic. It was Robin Artisan who allegedly provided the powders that killed her husbands. It was Robin who whispered the secrets of wealth into her ear. This charge of sexual congress with a demon transformed Alice from a criminal into a monster, a bride of Satan living in their midst. The bishop also fixated on a peculiar ritual that the stepchildren had whispered about.
He claimed that Alice was often seen at twilight, sweeping the dust of the streets toward the house of her son, William Outlaw. As she swept, she would chant a spell, a rhythmic incantation that the bishop recorded with trembling hand. "To the house of William my son, hie all the wealth of Kilkenny town." To the modern ear, this sounds like a superstition, a desperate prayer for prosperity. But to Bishop Ledreed, it was a binding spell, a magical theft that siphoned the luck and fortune of the neighbors and funneled it into the pockets of her favorite child. This explained, in the bishop's mind, why William Outlaw grew richer every day, while the honest men of Kilkenny struggled. It was not business acumen, it was theft by sorcery.
Armed with these terrifying accusations, Bishop Ledreed decided to act. He did not summon Alice for a quiet questioning. He launched an inquisition. He wrote to the Lord Chancellor of Ireland, Roger Outlaw, demanding the immediate arrest of Alice Kyteler and her son. The letter was a thunderbolt, written in the language of holy war. Ledreed expected the secular authorities to bow before the church, to tremble at the mention of heresy, and to hand over the witch immediately. But Richard de Ledreed had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated the web of power Alice had spun around herself. He was an Englishman in Ireland, a newcomer who did not understand the complex loyalties of the Anglo-Norman families. The man he wrote to, Chancellor Roger Outlaw, was not a stranger to Alice. He was her first husband's brother, her brother-in-law. When the Chancellor received the bishop's demand, he did not send soldiers to arrest Alice. Instead, he likely scoffed. To the secular lords of Ireland, Ledreed was a troublemaker, a fanatical monk who saw demons where there were only difficult women and family squabbles. Roger Outlaw tried to talk sense into the bishop. He urged him to drop the case, or at least to pursue it in a civil court, where the penalty was a fine, not the stake. He defended his family, dismissing the accusations as the ramblings of jealous stepchildren. But this rejection only threw gasoline on the bishop's fire. To Ledreed, the chancellor's refusal was not just nepotism, it was proof of the conspiracy. The devil's influence, he believed, had reached the highest levels of the Irish government. If the chancellor would not help him, it meant the chancellor himself might be compromised by the witch's magic. Ledreed refused to back down. He began to preach publicly against Alice, turning the pulpit into a weapon. He thundered against the brood of vipers in Kilkenny, warning the townspeople that their city was under the thrall of a powerful sorceress. The atmosphere in the town shifted from gossip to hysteria. People began to look at Alice's house with genuine fear. Was the successful banker truly a demon's lover? Did the black cat sitting on her wall really have the eyes of a man? The bishop's obsession became contagious. He was no longer just seeking justice for the dead husbands. He was fighting a cosmic war against Satan, and he was determined that Alice Kyteler would be the first casualty. He prepared to use the full weight of the church's power to crush her, drafting a summons that would force her to appear before him, not as a wealthy dame, but as a criminal answering for her soul. But Alice, sitting in her high-backed chair, surrounded by her wealth and her powerful friends, was not yet ready to surrender. She had defeated grief, she had defeated poverty, and she was determined to defeat this meddlesome monk. The clash that was about to occur would shake the foundations of medieval Ireland, pitting the immovable object of the church against the irresistible force of a woman who refused to burn. The summons from Bishop Richard de Ledreed was meant to be a death knell for Alice Kyteler's social standing, a terrifying command that would see her dragged before an ecclesiastical court in sackcloth and ashes. But the bishop had severely misjudged his quarry. Alice was not merely a wealthy merchant, she was the spider at the center of a vast web of influence that stretched from the marketplaces of Kilkenny to the highest halls of power in Dublin. When the bishop's men arrived at her door to serve the citation, they did not find a trembling woman begging for mercy. They found a formidable matriarch who treated the summons with open contempt. Alice knew the game of power better than any monk. She knew that in Ireland, the law of the land was often decided not by who was right, but by who had the stronger friends. And Alice Kyteler had the strongest friend of all, the Chancellor of Ireland, Roger Outlaw.
Roger Outlaw was not just a powerful political figure, he was family. As the brother of Alice's first husband, he had watched her rise, supported her business, and likely benefited from her financial acumen. When Alice went to him, she did not go as a witch, but as a kinswoman under siege by a foreign fanatic. She painted Ledred not as a holy man, but as a meddlesome Englishman who was overstepping his bounds, trampling on the rights of the Anglo-Norman settlers and disrespecting the local customs. Roger Outlaw listened. To him, the bishop's crusade was an insult to his own authority. If a bishop could arrest the wealthiest woman in Leinster without secular approval, then who was safe? The chancellor threw the full weight of the state behind Alice. He declared that the bishop's citation was invalid, a breach of proper procedure. But Alice was not content with mere defense. She wanted to crush the man who had dared to threaten her. In a move that stunned the entire country, Alice Kyteler went on the offensive. She used her wealth and connections to turn the legal system against the bishop himself. She claimed that Ledred had wrongfully excommunicated her without a trial, a serious breach of canon law, and she sued him for defamation. But the coup de grace came when she convinced the seneschal of Kilkenny, another ally named Arnold le Poer, a relative of her fourth husband, who sided with Alice against his own kin, to take drastic action. One morning, as Bishop Ledred was preparing to leave his palace to conduct a visitation of the diocese, he found his path blocked. Armed guards, wearing the livery of the seneschal, surrounded the holy man. They did not bow, they did not ask for a blessing. They arrested him.
The sight was unimaginable to the people of Kilkenny. A bishop, a successor of the apostles, a man anointed by the Pope, was dragged from his horse and marched through the streets like a common thief. He was thrown into the dungeons of Kilkenny Castle, a dark, damp hole usually reserved for murderers and rebels. For 17 days, Richard de Ledred sat in the darkness, listening to the drip of water and the scurrying of rats. It was a humiliation designed to break him, to show him that in Kilkenny, Alice Kyteler's gold was stronger than his God. Alice and her allies likely believed this would be the end of it. They thought the bishop would emerge chastened, shamed, and eager to return to England. They toasted their victory in the grand halls of Kilkenny, believing they had decapitated the beast of the Inquisition. But they were wrong. They had not broken the bishop. They had hardened him. In the silence of his cell, Ledred's fanaticism crystallized into a diamond-hard resolve. He now saw himself as a martyr, a suffering servant persecuted by the agents of Satan. When he was finally released, mostly because the scandal of imprisoning a bishop was becoming too dangerous even for the chancellor to ignore, he did not flee. He emerged from the castle gates with the cold, burning eyes of a man who has looked into the abyss and decided to set it on fire. He realized that fighting Alice on the grounds of local politics was a losing battle. She owned the seneschal, she owned the chancellor. So Ledred changed the battlefield. He would no longer treat this as a local crime. He would treat it as a threat to Christendom itself. Ledred bypassed the local courts entirely. He reached for a weapon that no chancellor could block, the charge of heresy. Under the complex laws of the time, heresy was a crime against God, and in matters of the soul, the church reigned supreme. He invoked the Ut Inquisitionis, a papal decree that gave inquisitors sweeping powers to detain, question, and punish anyone suspected of witchcraft, regardless of their rank or protection. He ordered the seneschal, Arnaud le Poer, to stand down or face immediate excommunication, a fate that would strip him of his lands, his titles, and his eternal soul. The threat worked. The wall of protection around Alice began to crack. The seneschal, brave enough to arrest a bishop, but terrified of hellfire, stepped aside. The chancellor, seeing the wind change, realized he could no longer openly protect his kinswoman without risking his own career. The net was closing. Bishop Ledred, now wielding the full, terrifying authority of the Inquisition, summoned Alice Kyteler once more. This time, there were no guards to stop him. This time, the citation was nailed to the doors of the cathedral, a public declaration of war. Alice, watching from her high windows, realized that her money had finally met its match. She could bribe a judge, she could not bribe the concept of original sin. The bishop was preparing a trial that would end in only one way: the stake. The fire that had burned in Ledreed's eyes was now being prepared in the town square.
Alice Kyteler was many things: greedy, ruthless, perhaps even wicked, but she was a survivor. She saw the writing on the wall. She knew that if she stayed in Kilkenny, she would burn. So she did what she had always done. She used her resources to secure her own future. In the dead of night, aided by the few loyal friends who remained, Alice Kyteler packed her most portable treasures: gold, jewels, and silver plate. She left behind her grand house, her vast estates, and even her son, William. She slipped out of the city gates, a phantom in the mist, and rode for the coast. It is believed she boarded a ship to England, vanishing into the anonymity of a new life. The Black Widow of Kilkenny had escaped the spiderweb she had helped to spin. She would never be seen in Ireland again, leaving no trace but the legend of her escape. But the Bishop of Ossory was not a man to be denied his pound of flesh. When he learned that the arch-heretic had flown, his fury was apocalyptic. He had built a pyre, and he was determined that someone would burn upon it. He could not catch the mistress, so he turned his gaze to those she had left behind. He looked at Alice's inner circle, her son, William Outlaw, and her servants. William was too powerful and wealthy to burn immediately. He bought his way out of a death sentence by agreeing to re-roof the cathedral with lead and perform public penance, a humiliating but survivable punishment. But there was one person who had no gold to offer, no powerful uncle to intervene, no horse to carry her to safety. Petronilla de Meath was Alice's maidservant. She had been with Alice for years, her confidant, her assistant, the woman who brushed her hair and perhaps, as the bishop claimed, helped her mix her potions. Petronilla was a woman of the people, poor and unprotected. When the bishop's men came for her, there was no seneschal to arrest them. They dragged her from her home, screaming, and threw her into the same dungeon where the bishop had once rotted. But unlike the bishop, she would not be released. Ledred focused all his frustrated rage upon this one woman. He was determined to wring the truth from her, to make her confess to the sins of her mistress. He ordered the torture to begin. The clash of powers had ended with the escape of the Titan, leaving the innocent to face the wrath of the victor alone. The darkness of the dungeon of Kilkenny Castle swallowed Petronilla, and the bishop prepared his instruments, ready to write the final bloody chapter of his crusade on her skin.
The dungeon of Kilkenny Castle was a place where hope went to die. Deep beneath the stone foundations, where the air was thick with the smell of mold and damp earth, Petronilla de Meath sat in the darkness. She was not a lady of high birth. She was a maidservant, a woman whose life had been defined by service to another. For years, she had walked in the shadow of Dame Alice Kyteler, brushing her hair, arranging her silks, and listening to her secrets. But now the mistress was gone, having slipped away into the night with her gold and her connections, leaving Petronilla to face the monster she had unleashed. The heavy door creaked open, admitting a slice of torchlight and the silhouette of Bishop Richard de Ledred. He did not come to offer comfort. He came to validate his crusade. To the bishop, Petronilla was not a person. She was a vessel of sin, a key that would unlock the truth of the heresy infecting his diocese. He needed a confession. He needed the world to know that the devil was real, and he was the only one strong enough to fight him. The interrogation, or the questioning, as the Inquisition politely called it, was brutal and methodical. Petronilla was stripped of her dignity and subjected to the lash. History records that she was whipped 6 times, a punishment designed to break the body and the spirit. With each strike, the bishop demanded the truth. but not the truth of her life. He wanted the truth of his nightmares. He wanted to hear about the demons, the potions, and the dark pacts. At first, she likely denied it, weeping and pleading her innocence, crying out that she was a good Christian woman. But pain has a way of reshaping reality. As the torture continued, the line between truth and delirium blurred. To stop the agony, Petronilla gave the bishop exactly what he wanted. She began to weave a tale that mirrored his own fevered accusations. In her broken voice, she confessed to being a witch. She told them that she and her mistress, Dame Alice, had rejected the church and the sacraments. She described how Alice would instruct her in the dark arts, teaching her how to cast spells to kill husbands and bewitch lovers. She spoke of the demon, Robin Artisan. Under the bishop's relentless prompting, she described him in vivid detail, sometimes a cat, sometimes a dog, and sometimes a dark man who smelled of sulfur and decay. She claimed she had seen her mistress lying with this demon, engaging in acts so foul they could barely be spoken aloud. She confessed to making powders from the brains of unbaptized infants and the hair of hanged men, using them to bring death to those who opposed them. It was a confession born of desperation, a frantic attempt to buy a moment of mercy, but it sealed her fate. Bishop Ledred had his proof. He had the words of a witch confirming his divine war. He did not see a tortured woman telling him what he wanted to hear. He saw the face of evil unmasked. The verdict was swift and unforgiving. Petronilla de Meath was found guilty of heresy and witchcraft. The punishment was not a fine or imprisonment, it was purification by fire. On the morning of November 3, 1324, the city of Kilkenny woke to a spectacle it had never seen before. A stake had been erected in the town square, piled high with bundles of dry wood and straw. The atmosphere was heavy with a mix of terror and morbid curiosity. The townspeople gathered in the hundreds, pressing against the wooden barricades. They had heard the rumors, the sermons, and the gossip. Now they were there to see the witch burn. But as the cart carrying Petronilla rattled over the cobblestones, many must have felt a cold knot of unease. They knew this woman. She was not a monster from a fairy tale. She was a maid, a neighbor, a familiar face in the market. She looked small and broken, a stark contrast to the terrifying sorceress the bishop had described. Petronilla was dragged from the cart and bound to the stake. The bishop stood nearby, chanting prayers for her soul, believing that the fire would cleanse her of the demons that possessed her. As the torch was applied to the dry wood, the flames caught quickly, crackling and leaping upwards. The heat hit the crowd before the sound of the screaming began. It is said that Petronilla died screaming not for the devil, but for mercy. As the smoke billowed into the gray Irish sky, choking the air of the city, a profound silence fell over the square. This was the first time a heretic had been burned at the stake in Ireland. It was a brutal, visceral demonstration of the Church's power, a warning to anyone who dared to defy the Bishop of Ossory. But even as the flames consumed Petronilla, the true target of the bishop's wrath was miles away, safe and alive. Alice Kyteler, the woman who had started it all, was never seen in Ireland again. Rumors abounded about her fate. Some said she settled in London, living quietly on her hidden wealth. Others whispered that she returned to Flanders, the land of her ancestors. She had outwitted the church, the state, and death itself. She had left a trail of dead husbands and a burning city behind her, escaping into the fog of history like a phantom. Her son, William Outlaw, also survived. Though he was complicit, his money and influence saved him from the fire. He was ordered to do public penance, visiting the shrines of the city and paying to re-roof the Cathedral of St. Canice with lead, a heavy price, but a price paid in coin, not blood. The weight of the tragedy fell entirely on the shoulders of the servant, the woman who had no gold to shield her from the fire. The burning of Petronilla de Meath did not end the hysteria, it legitimized it. Bishop Ledred continued his crusade for years, seeing enemies in every shadow, but he never achieved another victory as total as the one in the town square. The trial of the Kilkenny witches set a dark precedent. It proved that the charge of witchcraft could be used as a weapon to destroy the powerful and the weak alike. It showed that when the rich play games of power, it is the poor who pay the price. The ghost of Petronilla is said to still haunt the narrow lanes of Kilkenny, a spectral reminder of the injustice that took place 7 centuries ago. She is the forgotten victim, the footnote in the story of the famous Alice Kyteler. While Alice is remembered as the powerful, mysterious witch who got away, Petronilla is the symbol of the brutality of the age, a woman sacrificed on the altar of fear and fanaticism.
As the years turned into centuries, the story of Alice Kyteler became legend. It was told to children to frighten them, whispered in the dark as a cautionary tale. But we must remember the reality behind the myth. This was not a story of magic. It was a story of misogyny, greed, and the terrifying power of unchecked authority. Alice Kyteler may have been a murderer, or she may have been an innocent woman targeted for her independence. We will never truly know, but we know for certain that she was a survivor. In the end, the fire that burned in Kilkenny illuminated the darkest corners of human nature. It showed us how quickly a community can turn on its own, how easily fear can be weaponized, and how, in the game of survival, the only magic that truly matters is the magic of gold. The ashes of Petronilla de Meath have long since blown away, but the questions raised by her death remain, lingering like smoke in the air of history. And so, the fire dies down, and the story of the first witch of Ireland comes to a close. It is a tale that leaves a bitter taste, a reminder that history is often written by the survivors, while the victims are lost to the flames. Alice Kyteler escaped to live another day, but Petronilla de Meath paid the ultimate price for a crime she likely never committed. What do you think really happened in that dungeon? Was Alice truly a practitioner of the dark arts, or was she just a woman who knew too much and owned too much? If this journey into the dark past kept you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe to Overnight Historian. We have many more dark secrets to uncover, from the poisoners of Rome to the cursed tombs of Egypt. Sleep well, if you can, and remember, the past is never truly dead. It's just waiting for someone to light a candle. Good night.